The proud and warlike Romans could not ignore a humiliating defeat in 66 AD at the hands of this ancient people whose zeal for Judaism they had provoked to a point where continued submission became impossible. It was as though the Jews were challenging civilization itself, a civilization efficiently, though ruthlessly, organized for the benefit of mankind, that is, particularly the Roman master race. Nero's appointment of Vespasian, the most able and distinguished commander in the Roman army, to subdue the Jews and avenge the Roman arms, was an indication of the importance he attached to the revolt, and a tacit admission of the fiery spirit kindled in his Jewish subjects. In Ptolemais, Vespasian and his son Titus assembled a large army of 60,000 trained soldiers, including 3 of the most distinguished legions. Armed to the teeth and equipped with formidable siege engines, this highly organized and well-trained war machine invaded Galilee in 67 AD. The defenses of this northern area, which had to be subdued before Judea and Jerusalem could be safely tackled, had been placed in the hands of a young priest, Flavius Josephus, later to be famous as an historian. Josephus was not only disadvantaged in respect of military equipment and training, but by factional fighting and lack of unity amongst the Jews during their preparations. Some towns yielded to the Romans, while others stubbornly resisted, in particular Jotapata, where Josephus himself directed the defense against the whole might of the Roman army. The fall of each town was followed by a slaughter of large numbers of the exhausted inhabitants, the enraged pride of the legions being soothed only by an unrelenting and barbaric bloodbath. Josephus himself was taken prisoner and was thereafter used by the Romans to induce the Jews to surrender. Vespasian used the same tactics of methodical destruction and slaughter in subduing Judea in 68 AD. By degrees the Jewish commanders were driven from the field until resistance was concentrated in Jerusalem. Again, rivalry between Jewish zealots severely hampered their efforts, and so villainous were their deeds against each other and the common population that the people saw them as little less dangerous than the Romans. The violation of the sanctity of the temple led to civil war within the city, and vile atrocities were committed, Jew against fellow Jew. The leaders of the zealots murdered any of rank, influence or wealth that could at all be suspected of opposing them. Many tried to desert the city, but were slain by the zealots who guarded the roads. Thousands perished. According to Josephus, the terror was so great that the living feared to bury the dead, lest they be suspected of sympathy for an opposing cause. The suicide of Nero helped to prolong Jerusalem's agony. Anticipating promotion, Vespasian paused, merely containing his enemies, who seemed intent on their own destruction. After several emperors, who attempted to maintain a hold on the reins of power, had been assassinated, his patience was rewarded with the offer of the imperial purple, and he departed for Rome. Titus was commissioned to complete the task begun nearly 2 years before. With the size of the Roman army now swollen to 80,000, he set about subduing the rebellious city that contained, according to Josephus, about 24,000 Jewish soldiers. The strength of Jerusalem's fortifications and the ferocity of the zealots who manned them resulted in a protracted siege. During the interruptions caused by the sallies of the defenders, the Roman war machinery steadily progressed. The occasional attempts to induce surrender failed, and Titus was required to fight for every piece of ground. The onset of food shortages within the city gave him a terrible advantage. The Jews began to fight over whatever food remained, with strength being on the side of the insurgents. As the famine increased, so did the misery of the civilians, who were brutally robbed of what they tried to conceal. Old men, women and even children were tortured to surrender what little they had scrounged. Many poor wretches crept outside the defenses, under cover of darkness, to search for scanty herbs or weeds. Titus, in an act of utter barbarism, ambushed these emaciated souls and mercilessly crucified them before the walls. Around 500 such crucifixions per night were carried out, and the besieged beheld the screaming and writhing results in the morning. Finding his direct attacks still repulsed, Titus built a wall completely surrounding the city and awaited the inevitable results. The dead remained unburied, many being thrown over the walls where they lay in rotting heaps. Sickened by the putrefaction and stench, the Romans decided to renew the attack upon the dying city. By degrees, and with considerable effort and loss of life on both sides, they forced their way through the fortifications to the hallowed precincts of the temple itself, where the zealots made a concerted stand. In the fury of the battle, fire was used by both attackers and defenders. The magnificent temple went up in flames, through the work of the infuriated Roman soldiery, a loss of incalculable magnitude both in symbol and wealth. As the last resistance was overcome, the Roman swords massacred the helpless emaciated civilian population, to the extent of around 1/2 souls. Streams of blood flowed through the streets, helping to quench the flames. In all, according to Josephus, about 1 million perished in Jerusalem, with about 100,000 being sold into cruel slavery. With the exception of 3 towers, and part of the western wall of the temple area, the city was razed to the ground. Vespasian and Titus enjoyed a splendid triumph for their suppression of the independence of the Jewish nation in 70 AD. Their work of carnage and destruction was celebrated in a glorious procession through Rome that exhibited the spoils of conquest, the golden table and lampstand, the censers and silver trumpets, and a human chain of Jewish captives who would meet their gory end in the theater, to the delight of the populace. The magnificent triumphal arch of Titus, depicting the Roman success, was erected to commemorate it, an edifice that still stands, signifying the fundamental antagonism between the national David and the national Goliath, an antagonism that persists to this day. The tragedy of this great war, black as it was with human savagery and suffering, was relieved by one ray of light. It authenticated in the most literal fashion the words of Moses, Daniel, and Jesus. Moses' warning from Deuteronomy chapter 28, already cited in earlier videos, bears repeating. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young, and he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy ground, until thou be destroyed. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced wall come down, wherein thou trustedst, throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons, and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege, and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall straiten thee. The man that is tender among you, and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children, which he hath remaining, so that he will not give to any of them, of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left him, in the siege, and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemy shall straiten thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one, that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children, which she shall bear, for she shall eat them for want of all things secretly, in the siege, and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemy shall straiten thee in all thy gates. This prophecy had an awful fulfillment in the events of that war. Josephus records one account of a mother who, driven to madness by the continual marauding of the zealots, cooked and ate her unweaned child, to the horror of those who discovered the deed. A few days before his crucifixion, Jesus had prophesied of the end of the Jewish state. Prompted by a remark concerning the grandeur of the temple buildings, he had replied, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Later that day, while sitting upon the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem with the white and gold splendor of the temple in the foreground, he was questioned by 4 of his disciples. "When shall these things be?" His reply, and recorded in Matthew 24, Mark 13 and Luke 21, known as the Olivet prophecy, expanded on utterances wrung from his heart previously, during his entry into Jerusalem on the colt of an ass. "And when he drew nigh, he saw the city, and wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known in this day, even thou, the things which belong unto peace. But now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee, when thine enemies shall cast up a bank about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall dash thee to the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knowest not the time of thy visitation. The emotion expressed in these words, which described the coming calamity, would have been at least equaled by the grief he experienced when those sufferings of his people transpired. How different his attitude from that of the Christian mobs of later centuries who, as Milman remarked, let us not read the fate of the holy city in that unchristian temper which prevailed during the Dark Ages, when every Jew was considered a personal enemy of Christ, and therefore a legitimate object of hatred and persecution, but rather in the spirit of him who, when he looked forward with prophetic foreknowledge to its desolation, nevertheless was seen to weep over Jerusalem. In those private words to 4 of his disciples upon Mount Olivet, Jesus had warned them to watch for the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, phraseology that he equated with Jerusalem compassed with armies. This would be the sign for them to escape from the foreordained destruction. As he went on to explain, then let them that are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him that is on the housetop not go down to take out the things that are in his house, and let him that is in the field not return back to take his cloak. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on a Sabbath. For then shall be great tribulation, such as hath not been from the beginning of the world until now, no nor ever shall be. And except those days had been shortened, no flesh would have been saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. The unparalleled distress, misery, and carnage of the Roman-Jewish wars fulfilled Jesus' words to the letter. At the same time there was providential opportunity for his followers to make good their escape. In the lull before the siege began, the Christian community left Jerusalem for Pella, a settlement across Jordan, just below the Sea of Galilee, in an area not in open revolt. This desertion of the national cause, as it was viewed, greatly deepened the split between Jews and Jewish Christians, notwithstanding the fact that before long the majority of the common Jewish population in the Holy City would gladly have surrendered to the Romans, had the Zealots permitted them. But the authentication of these prophecies of the Old and New Testaments in the awful events of 66 to 70 AD had more far-reaching consequences in both time and scope for all mankind. The reliability of the Word of God of Israel was demonstrated before the civilized world in the most vivid manner, and this, in association with the spread of Hebrew Christianity, conferred a heavy responsibility from which none would escape. The Jews had reaped the results of their resistance to that word in a harvest of blindness and suffering that was not yet complete. But were the Gentiles any better? Imperial Rome, who now proudly carried the torch of civilization on behalf of all nations, had, in spite of the noble compliments she paid herself, sunk into savage barbarism. The blood of the noblest man that ever lived, Jesus of Nazareth, as well as that of his apostles, his nation, and of millions more, was on her hands. She was accumulating an account that would eventually have to be settled. The nation of Israel had experienced approximately 2,000 years of opportunity before the flames of Roman enmity consumed the temple and brought its institutions to an end. God, who had used Rome as an instrument for chastening his people, was now to place opportunity in her hands for a similar period, an opportunity provided by the Bible, the teaching and example of its true adherents, and the inescapable witness of the suffering Jew. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to get notifications of new videos. Like, share and comment below.